If you ask someone, "Are you afraid of death?" what is the most common response? Today, I will be discussing Staring at the Sun, Overcoming the Terror of Death by Irvin D. Yalom. This book is around 130,000 words long, and I will take about 25 minutes to summarize its essence for you. The core message is that to overcome the fear of death, one must face it directly. After thoroughly understanding death, you might then learn how to live better. Before we dive in, please click the subscribe button below the video to stay updated on the book insights we bring to our community. On the question we started this session, whatever the response, it is certain that most people are afraid deep down, yet no matter how much we don't want to die, death is inevitable. When faced with the final destination for all living beings, the most common emotion is fear. Fear leads to anxiety, which permeates life, triggering various reactions and causing numerous problems. No matter how deeply you suppress your fear of death, it will still resurface, like the bone demon in Journey to the West, taking various forms to trouble you. So, can we be like the Monkey King? See through the demon's disguise and smash it to dust with one blow? This book teaches us how to see through appearances to the essence, identify the manifestations and behaviors driven by death anxiety, and ultimately eliminate it. This will enable us to view death more rationally and approach life more passionately. The title of this book, Staring at the Sun, is intriguing. The name originates from a famous saying by the French thinker La Rochefoucauld: "One cannot stare at the sun or death." In many traditions, there are many taboos around death. For example, when someone dies, we have countless euphemisms for it. Confucius said, "We don't understand life. How can we know death?" He urged his disciples to focus on how to live rather than worrying about what comes after death. However, the Stoic school, one of the four major Greek philosophical schools, had the opposite view from Confucius. They believed that learning how to die is learning how to live well, which means, if we don't know death, how can we know life? Guided by this philosophy, Irvin Yalom wrote this book to face death head-on. Facing death is like staring at the sun. It will bring you pain, but after deeply reflecting on the inevitable pain of life, you will achieve inner peace and harmony. There are many books themed around facing death. For instance, Everyone Will Die, But I Always Thought I Wouldn't, co-authored by the American philosophers Thomas Cathcart and Daniel Klein, explores death and immortality from the perspectives of philosophy, theology, and psychology. They believe that since death anxiety stems from death, psychotherapy cannot truly solve it, as you can't prevent people from dying. The best way to cope with death anxiety is to experience it. However, Yalom believes that death anxiety can be conquered and anxiety can be eliminated. This is the unique value of staring at the sun. Yalom is a well-known name in the field of psychology. He is a famous American expert in group therapy and existential therapy. Before introducing Yalom, let's first understand the existential psychotherapy school. This school originated from 19th-century existentialist philosophy and was deeply influenced by several philosophers such as the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard, the German philosophers Nietzsche and Heidegger, and the French philosopher Sartre. Apart from existentialist philosophy, this school is also closely connected to psychoanalytic theory. Several pioneers of this school received psychoanalytic training and interacted with Freud. Existential psychotherapy focuses on themes related to existence, such as life and death, freedom, responsibility, the meaning of life, loneliness, and love. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and author of Man's Search for Meaning, also belonged to the existential psychotherapy school. Born on June 13, 1931, in Washington, D.C., Yalom's parents were Russian immigrants who moved to the U.S. after World War I. Now, Yalom has become one of the last remaining masters of international psychiatry. He is a Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at Stanford University and an authority in American group psychotherapy. He is one of the three main representatives of existential therapy, alongside Viktor Frankl and Rollo. The book is his in-depth interpretation of death anxiety from both professional and personal perspectives. From a professional perspective, it serves as a clinical psychotherapy guide to help therapists use existential therapy to address patients' death anxiety. From a general reader's perspective, it is a self-help book to help readers overcome their fear of death. The author analyzes the essence of death from a philosophical perspective and teaches us how to face death without regrets. After introducing the book and its author, let's delve into its three main themes. Let's examine what death anxiety is, how it manifests, and how to overcome it. Part 1. First, let's understand what death anxiety is. Death fear is simply our fear of death, which is a powerful emotion. Almost everyone is afraid of death. As long as this emotion is under control, it's not a big problem. However, if this fear leads to anxiety, it's a different story. Fear is psychological, while anxiety is physiological. Anxiety is the collection of physical sensations people experience when they encounter danger or threats. These sensations include rapid heartbeat, changes in breathing, nausea, sweating, trembling, hot flashes or chills, restlessness, and dizziness. If you are so afraid of death that you experience these physical symptoms, death anxiety has found you. In this book, death fear and death anxiety often refer to the same thing. Death anxiety often accompanies people throughout their lives, usually being most severe in adolescence and old age. In childhood, children become aware of death's existence and feel a vague fear. Yalom found that children often deny death, believing that children don't die. Adolescence is a period of death anxiety explosion. Adolescents tend to confront death anxiety in intense ways, leading to numerous behavioral problems such as suicide, violence, rebellion, and risk-taking. Reports show that suicide has become the leading cause of death among adolescents in recent years, which is heart-wrenching. After adolescence, establishing a family and career becomes the focus, keeping death anxiety at bay. In middle age, with children growing up and retirement approaching, death anxiety reappears. We all have heard of the midlife crisis, and death anxiety is a crucial part of it. From middle age, life starts declining. In old age, death seems imminent, and death anxiety often reaches its peak. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus said, "The root of all human suffering lies in our omnipresent fear of death." Epicurus had three famous arguments about death, which are useful for alleviating the fear of death. The first is the death of the soul. If our soul dies with us, there is no need to fear the afterlife. The second is death as complete nothingness. This means that death and I will never coexist. Since when we die, we won't know we are dead. What's there to fear? Thirdly, our state of non-existence after death is the same as before birth, which is the symmetrical poles of before and after life. I will elaborate on these three arguments later. Now let's look at what problems Epicurus said the omnipresent fear of death causes. These problems may seem unrelated to death, but they are, in essence, death anxiety in disguise, covertly affecting our lives. Thus, recognizing death anxiety is critical. Part 2. Now, let's look at the second main content of Staring at the Sun. The manifestations of death anxiety. Each person fears death differently, so death anxiety manifests differently in each individual. For some, death anxiety does not appear directly. It masquerades as various mental illnesses. Others will experience an obvious, conscious death anxiety. Based on this, we can divide the manifestations of death anxiety into two main categories. One type is explicit, where you can see it's caused by the fear of death, like the skeletal figure of the bone demon. If someone gets nervous, short of breath, and trembles at the thought of death, cannot sleep due to fear of death, avoids flying due to fear of plane crashes, won't leave the house for fear of getting hit by a car, or avoids swimming due to fear of drowning. These are explicit manifestations of death anxiety. However, even explicit death anxiety can sometimes be deceptive. For instance, one of Yalom's patients, Jenny, exhibited explicit symptoms. This 29-year-old woman would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and trembling from the fear of death. She was terrified that death would make her silently disappear into darkness, forgotten by the world. Jenny had seen several therapists to no avail, as they all believed her death anxiety was merely a substitute for other issues. Jenny had a recurring dream. Our whole family was in the kitchen with a bowl of earthworms on the table. My dad forced me to grab a handful, squeeze their bodies, and drink the juice. The imagery of squeezing earthworms and drinking juice in the dream is easily interpreted as related to the penis and semen, so previous therapists would ask if her father had sexually abused her. However, he had not. He was a decent man. Jenny later remembered a song that her sisters used to scare her with as a child, which mentioned people being buried underground after death, eaten by bugs, and oozing green liquid. This turned out to be the source of the dream, revealing that her fundamental problem was her fear of death. This discovery provided a breakthrough for Jenny's treatment. The other type of death anxiety manifestation is hidden, requiring exploration to identify. These are the bone demon's transformed states. Nightmares are often hidden death anxiety, like being chased, falling from heights, or witnessing death. The most challenging to identify are those anxieties that appear in other forms. Let me give you an example from the book to show you how tricky this bone demon can be and how to unravel its disguise. Susan, a middle-aged woman, sought psychological help due to severe anxiety after her son was caught dealing drugs. She cried for 4 days straight, couldn't eat or sleep, and was devastated by the thought that her son might die in a gutter. This was indeed a catastrophic event, enough to cause anxiety. However, Yalom felt her reaction was a bit excessive, as her sense of helplessness and despair did not match the severity of the stress event. Thus, he suspected her anxiety had another source. During therapy, the bandage on her neck became a breakthrough point. After learning that Susan had undergone a neck lift, he quickly delved into it, leading her to realize that the surgery stemmed from her fear of aging, which was actually a fear of death. Thus, her true anxiety was death anxiety, which had been redirected to her son. After focusing therapy on death, Susan's anxiety disappeared within 2 weeks. Part 3. We've discussed the 2 types of death anxiety manifestations, explicit and hidden. If we keep our eyes open, we can eventually see through appearances to their essence. Once we learn to recognize death anxiety, let's move on to the main point of this book: how to overcome death anxiety. Remember 3 key words: awakening experiences, ideas, and intimate connections. In simple terms, insight from awakening experiences, coupled with the power of ideas and intimate connections, can effectively reduce death anxiety. Together, they ultimately lead to personal transformation. Let me explain what this means. First, let's look at awakening experiences. What are awakening experiences? I'll give you 2 examples to clarify. In Dickens' novel, A Christmas Carol, the protagonist Scrooge is a cold, selfish miser who is visited on Christmas Eve by 3 ghosts. The ghost of Christmas past shows him his lonely childhood. The ghost of Christmas present takes him to a subordinate's family Christmas gathering to see how the poor celebrate. The ghost of Christmas yet to come shows him aging in bed with no visitors, his possessions taken by strangers, and his lonely grave. Finally, standing at his own grave, he reconsiders the meaning of life, and his character transforms at that moment. The next day, he becomes a charitable person. In Tolstoy's epic, War and Peace, the protagonist Pierre is sentenced to death. On the execution ground, Pierre sees the people before him executed and is awaiting his turn when he is suddenly reprieved. After narrowly escaping death, Pierre changes from a zombie-like existence to someone full of enthusiasm and purpose in life. Why did these two characters undergo such dramatic changes in their attitudes towards life? This is the power of awakening experiences. In the face of life and death, they gained insight into the true meaning of life. In philosophical terms, they became aware of authentic existence. This is a concept from the German philosopher Heidegger, who believed humans have two different modes of existence. One is inauthentic existence, a mode where you are completely immersed in your surroundings, driven by what is around you, and chasing fleeting things like beauty, wealth, status, and fame. The other is authentic existence, where you focus on existence itself, have a clear understanding of life and death, and are thus more eager to pursue life's meaning and bravely take responsibility for yourself and others. By now, you probably understand what awakening experiences are. Important moments that trigger self-awareness, similar to what we often call enlightenment. They can lead to significant change, transitioning people from inauthentic to authentic existence modes. Is this a bit abstract? Let's take a look at the personal experience of Viktor Frankl, the father of logotherapy, which might make it easier to understand. During World War II, Frankl was imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp for 4 years, teetering on the edge of life and death almost daily. Frankl described a particular scene where a group of people arrived at the concentration camp after a long trek and were ordered to line up before a Nazi officer. The officer casually pointed them in one direction or another with his finger. Those directed to the right were immediately placed in a separate line, while those directed to the left were in a different line. No one knew the difference in treatment between the two lines. When Frankl's turn came, someone quietly told him that those directed to the right would be sent to work, while those directed to the left would be sent to a special camp for the elderly and infirm. So, Frankl stood as straight as possible to appear more spirited. After hesitating for a moment, the officer assigned him to the right. That evening, he learned that those assigned to the left were sent directly to the crematorium. This experience made Frankl realize that one must make oneself useful every day and give life meaning. Although death looms daily, he believes it is not a threat but a driving force that instills a sense of urgency. Life is short, so one must seize every opportunity to make life as fulfilling as possible and take every chance to do meaningful things. This feeling can also be expressed through some famous lines: so much to do, so little time. The heavens turn. Time presses. 10,000 years are too long. Seize the day. Hearing this, you might wonder. The examples you mentioned are about near-death experiences or encounters with ghosts. But ordinary people's lives aren't that thrilling. So where do awakening experiences come from? Ordinary life is also full of awakening experiences. Yalom found that awakening experiences often occur when individuals face significant life events. What counts as significant life events? For instance, the death of a loved one, you or someone close suffering from a severe illness, the breakup of a close relationship, a divorce, reaching milestone moments like getting married or celebrating a 60th birthday, experiencing significant trauma like an earthquake, fire, or robbery, becoming an empty nester, retiring, entering a nursing home, having a meaningful dream, and so on. Awakening experiences can be powerful but often fleeting. How can one turn a momentary realization into lasting insight and ultimately bring about life changes? This requires the power of ideas and relationships. The ideas we refer to here are the insights of ancient sages regarding death. Ideas, though invisible and intangible, have magical power. Consider the influence of religious beliefs on followers. Yalom found in clinical practice that certain ideas serve as beacons for patients tormented by death anxiety, guiding their way. Here, we'll focus on two significant concepts related to death: Epicurus's famous views and the concept of rippling. Epicurus was a renowned atheist philosopher in ancient Greece. A proverb best describes his main philosophical view: life is short, enjoy it while you can. That's right, he is labeled as a hedonist. But the pleasure Epicurus advocated is not superficial sensory pleasure. It's a moderate, healthy, natural pleasure. Regarding death, Epicurus had three famous views. The first view is the death of the soul, which contradicts Socrates' belief in the immortality of the soul. Socrates believed that after death, the soul would be reunited with kindred spirits, a view that significantly influenced the Christian belief in the afterlife. Epicurus believed there is no hell or judgment after death, refuting the religious leaders' assertion that those who don't follow the doctrine will be punished after death. This view is particularly effective in alleviating death anxiety because going to hell after death is a common source of death anxiety for many. Christianity and Buddhism both have concepts of hell. Chinese Taoism also integrated Buddhist concepts to create its version of the underworld. His second view is death as complete nothingness, which holds that when a person dies, both the soul and body vanish. Since one cannot perceive one's death, what is there to fear about it? Yalom found in practice that people have all kinds of vivid and detailed fantasies about death. For example, some people imagine themselves lying in a heavy coffin, surrounded by darkness, unable to see, hear, or feel anything, while the whole world continues functioning normally without them knowing. This sense of helplessness and isolation from the world leaves them devastated. Epicurus's view tells us that these thoughts scare only the living. The dead have no consciousness. Death and the self will never coexist. Epicurus's third view is symmetrical poles of before and after life. This means that the state before one's birth is the same as the state after death. There is no afterlife, and there's no need to fear anything after death. The famous Russian novelist Nabokov described this brilliantly in his autobiography. Our existence is merely a brief flash of light, sandwiched between two pieces of eternal darkness. These two ends of darkness are essentially indistinguishable. People can calmly accept the darkness before birth, but are unwilling to face the one approaching them. Having discussed Epicurus's three famous views, let's now look at rippling. What is rippling? Yalom uses the word rippling in the original book, referring to the process of ripples spreading out when you throw a stone into a pond. Each of us is a center, intentionally or unintentionally influencing those around us. This influence can last for many years, even generations, and can be passed on to more people through others, continuously spreading like ripples in a pond. This concept can help address three common problems in death anxiety: a sense of limitation, impermanence, and meaninglessness. Although our lives are limited, we can extend our lives in other ways by passing on our values and actions to the next generation, potentially being passed down for generations. For instance, the wisdom of ancient sages, parents, and teachers' education for their children and students, and so on. Although life is impermanent, some parts of us will endure and live on in others' memories through the influence of rippling. If we leave something meaningful behind through rippling, like specific qualities or wisdom, or even just leave kindness or comfort, life is meaningful. Yalom himself is the best example of rippling. As an excellent psychotherapist, he has helped many people out of suffering, and as a writer, he conveys his life wisdom and insights, influencing countless people. By now, you might be asking yourself, what can I leave behind through rippling? In fact, you may have already left something behind without knowing it. A patient once told Yalom something that significantly reduced her death anxiety. She said that 30 years after graduation, she attended her first high school reunion. An old classmate hugged her excitedly, thanking her for some advice she gave as a teenager that not only changed her life but also benefited her daughter. The patient said she couldn't remember what advice she had given, but the rippling effects of her actions as a teenager were still spreading. Yalom found in his practice that ideas effectively counter death anxiety, and combining them with intimate connections with others makes them even more powerful. Let's now discuss the role of intimate relationships. Who is most likely to be entangled by the bone demon of death anxiety? The answer is lonely people. If someone has never felt loved within their family and has no close friends to share their inner fears, they can easily fall into death anxiety. Lacking a sense of belonging, they can only be swallowed up by this anxiety in solitude and despair. A sense of belonging is a basic human need, and many studies show that intimate relationships are essential to happiness. However, death is lonely. It not only separates you from others, but also from the entire world. Yalom believes that humans face two types of loneliness, daily and existential. The former is the loneliness we're familiar with, characterized by the absence of intimate, lasting relationships. The latter is much deeper. As the saying goes, we are born alone. To existentialist philosophers, everyone is thrown into this world alone, living in a world only they can fully understand, and finally leaving alone. Death encompasses both types of loneliness. Out of fear of death, people often unconsciously distance themselves from those nearing death. And when death finally arrives, everyone must face it alone. To alleviate the loneliness of death, cruel and absurd phenomena have appeared throughout human history, such as sacrificial burials, where rulers had slaves buried with them, and widows were buried with their deceased husbands. In fact, according to Epicurus, after death, all is empty, so there's no feeling of loneliness. Such customs merely comfort the living. Reducing death's loneliness should be addressed while one is still alive. How can one reduce death's loneliness? Since loneliness arises from a lack of intimate relationships, the best solution is to establish intimate connections. When people are closely connected with others and can share their fears of death, they can face death more calmly. In addition to talking about death fears with close ones, group discussions can also help effectively reduce death anxiety. When group members share common pain, their relationships become intimate. In this book, Yalom mentions a woman approaching death who said in a therapy group, "It's like a dark night, and I'm floating alone in a small boat in the harbor, seeing many other boats' lights. I know I can't reach them or join them, but how comforting it is to see those lights flickering in the bay." These words vividly describe the profound impact of perceiving others' presence and companionship on someone nearing death. We've covered a lot today. Let's summarize briefly. First, we briefly introduced what death anxiety is. The fear of death is pervasive, and death anxiety accompanies people throughout their lives. Second, we explored the manifestations of death anxiety. Some people's death anxiety is explicit, leading them to avoid various behaviors and experience symptoms that significantly impact normal life. Other people's death anxiety is hidden. They transfer their fear of death to other matters and exhibit symptoms that seem unrelated to death. In real life, this hidden death anxiety often requires deep digging to find its source. Finally, we focused on how to overcome death anxiety. We first mentioned awakening experiences, the self-awareness triggered by significant life moments, similar to what we often call enlightenment, which can lead to great realization. Some essential ideas deepen our understanding of death, such as Epicurus's 3 famous views on death and the concept of rippling. Armed with the power of ideas and individuals or groups to talk to and share fears about death, one can effectively reduce death anxiety. Utilizing awakening experiences can ultimately lead to personal transformation. Approaching life and death with a more positive and enthusiastic attitude, taking responsibility for oneself and others, and living a meaningful life. Death is an eternal theme as timeless as heaven and earth. We can say that since humans gained consciousness, they began contemplating death. The earliest reflections took the form of primitive religious activities, myths, and rituals, later becoming major themes in philosophy and religion. Different cultures and ideas have produced different views on death. For example, Confucianism believes that humans were created by heaven and earth and should follow their path. The crucial question for Confucianists is not whether to die or not, but the purpose behind the death, such as sacrificing oneself for benevolence or righteousness. This perspective has inspired countless heroes and martyrs for thousands of years. Living great, dying glorious. Taoism believes that life and death are like dreams and waking, a natural state transition with no inherent meaning. Some religions consider reincarnation the foundational concept, emphasizing seeking salvation in this life for the next. Ordinary people often yearn for immortality, hoping for an elixir that will transcend life and death. Not only were the ancients like this, but immortality is also one of the critical areas of research in modern life sciences. Today, death has become a research subject for biology, medicine, philosophy, psychology, sociology, and other disciplines. From basic questions about death to studies on attitudes toward death and discussions on death education, our understanding of death has become more comprehensive. Yalom's Staring at the Sun not only explores the causes and manifestations of death anxiety, but also points out effective ways to overcome it, achieving the goal of death education. Yalom insightfully pointed out in his book that the fear of death is often closely related to a sense of a wasted life. The less you have truly lived, the stronger your fear of death will be. The less you can fully experience life, the more afraid of death you will be. So, fear of death is often because one has not lived well. If you live earnestly and with as few regrets as possible, you can face death calmly. That's the essence of this book. You can click the description below the video to find the link to the book. Welcome to read it. You can also share this book with your friends. If you like the content of Daily Book Dive, click the subscribe button to stay updated. Your encouragement helps us continue bringing book essence to our community. Congratulations, you've finished another book.